Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another session of the Doctor's Lab with Dr. Khalid Green and myself, Dr. Abdul Baker. Assalamu alaikum, Khalid. How are you?
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah.
How have you been these past 2 weeks?
Alhamdulillah. Okay. Just thankful and grateful to Allah Azza wa Jal.
Alhamdulillah. And some congratulations are in order. And I think it's only apt that I say congrats on the publication of your PhD thesis, published, available on Amazon. I rushed to purchase a copy, so I've got my Kindle edition, and I want to ask you to show us the cover of the book, and I will share mine as well, just to show our audience that we have published our works, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah. So this is it. Let's see if we can get it there, right there. There's a
MashaAllah. Allahumma barak.
Larger in the actual print was larger than I had expected, but inshallah ta'ala the next one will be hopefully more up to par.
No, but the publication, that's the main issue. So my book, this is my one, which is coming up to the first publication was 9 years ago, followed by the paperback edition, which came out 2015, mashallah. So we're showing this to, I think, as evidence of the fruits of our labor, as it were, with our PhD studies, and the reason for the Institute for Contemporary Studies of Salafism, and also for this Doctor's Lab podcast that we agreed to start up, mashallah. And the feedback that we've got on the whole, Khalid, I think yourself and I would agree that has been overall very positive. Would you agree?
Alhamdulillah. Yes. Alhamdulillah. A lot of positive feedback. The people are interested in these topics. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. And wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah to our sister Salwa, mashallah, tabarakallah. And I want to personally say to her, jazakallah khair, for her insights and comments and positive feedback that she shares, not only in the show, but communicating across other social media platforms, mashallah, tabarakallah. Now, Khalid, we said today we were going to cover something that we'd been touching upon in the previous two shows, and that was the typology, or were the typologies that have been crafted around Salafiyyah, around Salafism. Okay, the categorizations of Salafiyyah by Western academia, which is now being used by Muslim academics, non-Salafi Muslim academics, I hasten to add. And we said we were going to discuss these and their implications. So I want to ask you, where do you want to start off? Is it going to be, do you want to refer to some academia from non-Muslim scholars? Or do you want to go from your PhD and other religious references in that respect? And you're welcome, Sister Salwa.
Yes. Well, I was thinking first just giving a quick maybe overview of how my chapter 1 looked, because that kind of led into the typology and a critique of Quentin, his typology, which is well known in the Western academic circles. So first I guess I'll begin with that, and then we can kind of look at the typology itself, or we'll kind of let it flow from there. Bi'idhnillah ta'ala. Yeah,
I agree. So fire away.
Yeah. So first I began, which my logic was to as we talked about prior, the definition of terms and so forth, and that was in the introduction. Then in the actual chapter 1, I discussed the Salafi creed and methodology. That was really the title of chapter 1, the creed and methodology. So that way we have a foundation to build from. And I began by defining Salafiyyah or Salafism, the principles of Salafism, because I found that these terminologies were kind of used by some of our contemporary Salafi scholars. And then, of course, the creed, meaning the aqidah of Salafis, the names of Ahl Sunnah, because a lot of people wonder, well, where's this term Salafiyyah coming from? You guys are Wahhabis, and you came from this and you came from that, and you made this term up, and all kind of claims are out there. So it was very important to lay this foundation to address those things in how our scholars deal with them. And then I went on to reference the reference for the Salaf in Hadith, in Hadith literature. How does this term Salaf or Salafiyyah, how does it come from Hadith literature? Then on to Minhaj or methodology, talked about jurisprudence between Salafis, madhabs and taqleed, blind following, and madhahib as far as especially the fiqh madhabs. And then also, because of a big rival of Ahl Hadith, which Salafis are very much influenced by, is the rationalists, and Ahl Ra'i. Ahl Ra'i and their madhab and rationalism, and then going on to Ahl Kalam, the people of rhetoric. Then I talked about differences between Ahl Sunnah basically and the Ahl Kalam, and the reason for differences, then talking about the differences between actually Ahl Sunnah themselves. So some of the contemporary discourse that we find, and unfortunately discord between a lot of our scholars, and where a lot of the splitting took place from the various groups, and we could go on and on about that. Unfortunately, those internal splits and maybe some of the reasons for that. Also, some examples on how Ahl Sunnah dealt with errors. I had to then go and, of course, define what is Hizbiyah. So what is the opposition to Salafiyyah in essence, the characteristics or some characteristics of Hizbiyah, problems with contemporary classification. So then it led on to the typology, really, the classifications, mainly on how Western academics, but this is not unique to the West. This is also the case we find in the East, in the literature. If you go to the Arabic newspapers in Tunisia, in Saudi Arabia, maybe less so in Saudi Arabia, but to a greater or lesser extent, but all over, you'll find these kind of these classifications, and using Salafiyyah in mixing it with a lot of those other groups and sects. Then I talked about the problems with contemporary classifications, and then the jihadi takfiri paradigm was the last subsection of chapter 1, and then I concluded. So that was how I went with my chapter 1 there, and kind of some of the logic with that.
What I would say, thank you for giving that structural breakdown. And Amin to Abdurrahman Hussein for your dua, mashallah, and you, my brother. Yeah. Now, what I want to do then is I'm going to wind it back a little bit based on aspects that you've discussed now. So when we're looking at the typology, you said that the last aspect you talked about what is termed now as the jihadi sort of constituency, if I may. And we spoke about terminology a few weeks ago, whereas that term jihadi and the pejorative way it's being used now, the negative connotations, we've said is incorrect. Jihad is a noble phraseology and term, and a classical term in that particular instance, and it should not be misconstrued or misunderstood in any other shape or form than the classical understanding as is expounded correctly by the contemporary scholars and Salafis today. Okay, we're not going to minimize it to say it's just confined to the jihad of the nafs and the jihad of the heart in that instance. And we're not going to take it to the other extreme that we see the extremists have taken it, the Khariji Takfiri extremism, which is actually terrorism in that particular instance. We are between the two polarizations. But what I want to do now is I'm going to refer to and then come back to you from aspects of your chapter. I'm going to refer to frameworks that I examined from Western academia and the ones that I developed in my first chapter of the PhD. And what I'm going to ask is, before doing that, going back to where the typology really took root and Western academics jumped upon it. And for those who don't know, I'll give a summary of what this academic, Quinton Rotorovic, who I know, who I've met, did with this typology. And we have from Joas Wagemakers, his reference, his paper, academic paper, revisiting Rotorovic. categorizing and defining the branches of Salafism. And he started by stating here, quote, "The work of Quinton Witorovic has been instrumental in furthering the study of Salafism, the branch of Islam whose adherents claim that they tried to emulate the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the pious predecessors, as-Salaf as-Saleh, usually associated with the first 3 generations of Muslims, as strictly and in as many spheres of life as possible. Wiktorovic's publications, based on his research on Salafism in Jordan, as well as in other contexts, were among some of the first works on this subject and have been highly influential, particularly Anatomy of the Salafi Movement, published in 2006. In this article, Wiktorovic deals with many aspects of Salafism, including the division of Salafis into purists, politicos, and jihadis. This categorization of Salafis has been adopted by many other scholars of Salafism and Islamism, and even many of those who did not directly cite his categorization use one that basically comes down to the same thing. Now, obviously, you and I addressed that, and you saw that in my PhD studies, I addressed that quite emphatically. And what I want to do now is refer to a framework that I used and explain that framework to demarcate and highlight that what he had actually done, and other Western academics, and now Muslim ones from the liberal perspective, have done, is conflate 3 different entities or movements in Islam into one and call them all Salafi along a particular spectrum. So if I can ask Hassan, a moderator from behind, to put up the first framework, please, for me. And if colleagues asked me about this framework, this was first produced in 2005 by the Combating Terrorism Center. And these are actual constituencies, the formulation of particular communities. And the wider community is the bigger populace of Muslims, as we can see. Then they titled the Islamists, the more Ikhwani, politicized Muslim Brotherhood kind of context of community, in the next largest generic community, which is housed within the wider populace of Muslims. Then we see moving in a smaller, slightly more insular community of the Salafis. And within the Salafi community, not within, and that doesn't mean that they are Salafi, but you'll find the so-called jihadis, the Takfiris, the Kharijis, positioning themselves amongst Salafi communities than Islamists and wider Muslims. Why? Because of physical appearance, because of particular affinities to aspects of ideology, Aqidah, to the Salafis. But as we know, that they are divorced from Salafiyyah due to a methodological and ideological divorcing from main Salafi creed and Aqidah. So these communities here, if we look at the 3, the Islamist, Salafi, jihadis, for want of a better phrase of the other 2, Islamists and jihadis, jihadis being the Takfiris, these 3 different communities with different ideological perspectives, and we spoke about Tawheed and Hakimiyya being used as a 4th category to politicize. Both the Islamist community does that, the jihadi community does that, and I want to use the term Ikhwani Muslimin, Muslim Brotherhood type of community. I don't like the phrase Islamist as it's used today, and jihadis we will use as Khariji, Takfiri kind of communities. So we know those 2 communities on either side of the Salafis have politicized ideological aspects of Tawheed, none other than Tawheed al-Hakimiyya. The question now comes, Hassan, if you could remove the diagram now, thank you. The question now comes, how did Quinton Witorovic and other Western academics come to this conclusion that those 3 communities, not the wider Muslim community that I've shown, those 3 Muslim constituencies are all one in the same along a different spectrum? Salafi politicos being in the middle, that being the Islamist, Salafi jihadis being the Takfiri, Khariji, inner circle, and Salafi quietists or purists being the Salafi community. So even from other Western academia, so long ago as 2005, we see 3 distinct constituencies that are not the same from ideological perspectives,
Right.
and not the same from manhaj methodological perspectives. And I know we agree on this. What did your research say to that? That's what I highlighted as a framework, and I'll bring some other ones to reinforce that counter argument to the typologies that are now conflating the three movements.
Yeah, I was in agreement with you with that. The only thing I would say, and that I found in my studies, is so I would kind of look at the jihadi takfiri ideology in general, and that depends upon the time, that they were kind of a branch of the politicals, because most of the politicals, they have that kind of that kutubist madhab, if you want, or methodology, where they were very influenced by Sayyid Qutb, and that and his expressions of political activism, which was very much articulated through the jihadist precepts, through being, just emphasizing jihad, but jihad also against the rulers. So I really saw that if some of those Western academics were more honest, or maybe they need to further research, that they should be positioning those groups. Those groups should be more or less in line. They're more in line than with Salafis. But what I found with more contemporary groups, so I would say that with Al-Qaeda, this is actually a line in which those groups have kind of split. That Al-Qaeda, if you look at their literature, like Ayman Zawahiri, and then prior to, sort of a branch from them would have been Zarqawi and so forth, and Bin Laden and others, that they were very much influenced by Qutubiyya, by Sayyid Qutb's thought and so forth, and his Hakimiyya, as you mentioned, and so forth. Whereas you find that ISIS or Daesh, in their manifesto right off the get-go, when they sent out a manifesto, I forgot what it's called. It's translated in English, not that I'm promoting it, but I have the English and Arabic copy. And, right off the get-go, they try to emphasize a tie with the Salaf. And they try to distance themselves kind of with Qutubist. And they made takfir of a lot of Ikhwan Muslimin. Like, if you look at their articles, so you saw right off the get-go, they tried to position themselves with Salafis. Or not with Salafis. For them, Salafis are, traitors and this and that and the other, but they tried to position that they are the real people of the Salaf.
Yes.
That was one thing I found, which different, where you don't find that with the Al-Qaeda as much. They didn't really care. They were like, hey, we love Sayyid Qutb and great works and this and that and the other, and we like this and this and this. And their ideology kind of went along with that. And their political movement, really.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think that when we are talking about Salafiyyah and from the Western perspective, some will counter what we're saying and saying, well, no, this is an established point that there are typologies, and they will refer to those who they considered within a Western academic perspective as being Salafi, when that wasn't actually the case. Now, referring to Henri Lozier, his book, The Construction of Salafiyyah, or this is a paper emanating from that book, The Construction of Salafiyyah, Reconsidering Salafism from the Perspective of Conceptual History. Now, he stated as follows: the notion of Salafism has become a victim of its own success, and as a result has often been used loosely without regard to its history. Indeed, many studies have affirmed the existence of Salafism at various points in history, from the 9th to the 21st centuries, even when evidence for such claims have been tenuous, undisclosed, or non-existent. And then he criticizes it. He says, over time, this relative lack of rigor in the secondary literature has perpetuated and validated the otherwise arguable idea that each era has had its own version of Salafiyyah. And what he says is key: the insidious consequences of this counter-historical slip, that Salafiyyah is different in each age, which we would disagree with, neglect the process by which the conceptualization of Salafism developed and it shouldn't be ignored. So then he talks about, in another context, on the other hand, the belief that Jamaluddin al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdul spearheaded a movement of Islamic modernism called Salafiyyah in the late 19th century relies on assumptions rather than evidence. Contrary to conventional wisdom, and despite numerous attempts to portray these two men as Salafis after the fact, there is still no proof that they ever promoted Salafism.
Right.
And that they either used a substantive Salafiyyah or conceptualized a religious orientation of that name. So what's important here is that acknowledgement, I think, from Lazier, which not many academics have done. Some have criticized him in that instance, but he's moved these reformist thinkers to the side, as I did in my PhD studies, as you've done in your PhD studies. So we now need to come back down to Salafiyyah. And I asked you a few weeks ago whether you felt that Salafiyyah was heterogeneous or it was homogenic, and you said it's homogenic, which I agree with from the point of Aqidah in that particular instance. And issues of manhaj difference, we have to look at the actual issues that are at hand. Now, some have said, well, okay, the jihadis and the Islamists are Salafi, and it's in the area of manhaj methodology that they differ. So how can you say they're not Salafi? Let's discuss that. Let's look at that.
For one, and that's why I had to. It was very important to lay out these foundations. What is Salafiyyah? What I would say first and foremost is that what makes Salafiyyah is that Aqidah and is that manhaj, is that methodology.
Yes.
And that Salafis do not have a different manhaj. They do not have a different manhaj. There is one Salafi Aqidah, there's one Salafi manhaj.
Right.
You will find different usloob from different ulama, and that is more in the realm of, ijtihad and personal. For example, some scholars may teach books more on, reformation, that tarbiyah with tazkiyah, as Imam al-Albani articulated, and really set a contemporary emphasis on those principles of purifying yourself and the education, the ilm, seeking knowledge. So some scholars, their works might really emphasize, soul purification, ibadat and things like this. You will find other Salafi scholars with the same manhaj, the same methodology, the same aqidah, who emphasize and may specialize more in defending the religion by criticizing the people of innovation and desires. And they may be very, in the forefront of that. So it's a lot of people want to distinguish and say, hey, those guys are on different manhaj. No, we say, no, absolutely they're not. They accept one another. They are on the same aqidah. It's not that the one who's focusing on purification denies refuting the people of innovation or people who have deviated from the Salafi creed and methodology. They are one and the same, but some they specialize and they choose to emphasize, and some in various ways of emphasizing the religion and educating people in the religion. Okay.
This is very important. I think there's another, which is quite recent, observation that we need to acknowledge without going off at a tangent as we've done in the previous weeks. And that's been, unfortunately, there's been a minority element that has been quite vocal that has now taken matters that are subsidiary, that are furu', okay? And they've been doing this for the past few decades, and they've been making them usul issues and to split, because it's in the usul where when differences take place in the usul, we do need to stand up and pay attention, like we've done with the theories, like we've done with the Ikhwanis, like we've done with the Sufis, like we've done with those who've moved away from the core ideology of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, of which the Salafis adhere to. So changing subsidiary matters, fiqh issues, and changing them and trying to place them within the realm of the usul, Salafis have done that, okay? And that's really problematic. But not, as I said, not going off too much on a tangent there, even amongst Western academics, we see here, okay, and I'm referring again to Joas Wagemakers. I can't pronounce his surname properly. That's how it's spelt. So I'd say that literally. But he's saying here, In fact, there seems to be hardly a meeting, seminar, workshop, or conference on Salafism that goes by without some fierce discussion on his division of Salafism. That's Quintin Retarovics, with some participants expressing skepticism and doubts about the categories of purists, politicos, and jihadis, but usually without being able to come up with an alternative. Underneath the seemingly consensual surface, there seems to be some unease about Retarovic's definition of these categories, and rightly so. And that's why the fact that they can't come to a conclusion about this three conflated categorization of Salafiyyah is because it doesn't fit, because it's something historically and classically that did not emerge from the annals of Islamic history, jurisprudence, scholarly works from our ulama. And we only have to look at our contemporary scholar today. And again, Wajmakers quotes him or refers to him, where he said, the Saudi Salafi scholar, Salih Fawzan al-Fawzan, has pointed out that Salafis have a manhaj for their theological beliefs, their views on worship, and their attitude towards dawah and society, indicating that manhaj applies to more spheres of life than just politics. Now, that's just what you're speaking to there. So he acknowledges from a key, huge, kibar scholar today that what manhaj actually stands for. And this is the thing that I find frustrating, which I actually spoke to, Khalid. There's been an academic snobbery from a Western perspective, okay, in that they've ignored or marginalized or minimized Eastern scholasticism from our ulama. And we know that scholars are the inheritors of the revelation. So they're standing from a religious perspective. Their standing theologically, methodologically, is far superior than any Western academia as it stands today, even though there may be more institutions that we know of from a Western perspective. So the fact that they have not referred to scholastic works of the ulama, of our scholars, but yet they will come and research within the Eastern worlds and interview scholars and then come back with their own conclusions, is why I say there's academic snobbery in that instance. But I want to bring another framework, because we're talking about how our work informed on this and how we try to tease out these elements here. When we're speaking, I gave that the community constituent perspective, saying why these three constituencies are different. They cannot be one in the same. Let's look at that from a more practical perspective. And I want to show two dimensions of a framework that I developed called the funnel theory. And if Hassan can put up one of those, and I'll explain that. So when you look at this funnel, you can imagine a funnel, okay? And you can imagine the gravitational pull down the funnel. So at the top of the funnel, where the pressure is less, we have the more liberal, extreme, as I've called it, or the secular Muslims. And if you think of those concentric circles that I just showed in the first diagram, the wider Muslim populace is at that uppermost level, very generic and everything like that, okay? As you move down where the gravitational pull is, then you may find more Ikhwani, Muslim Brotherhood communities, not at the actual top, but further down due to their politicization, okay? Now, at the very neck of the funnel, you can see I've put on that side mainstream Muslim community issues. That's where just say the Muslim Brotherhood, the if you want, is Islamist kind of communities reside. Remember, this is a societal model that we're looking at.
Right.
Salafi communities are at the hard end of interventions when countering and fighting extremism for that matter. So we're right at the edge where that gravitational pull is strongest, because we're able to bring people back up through, away from that gravitational pull towards the bottom. As you see, that's where the so-called jihadi, takfiri constituencies lie. So when we're looking at this from a societal perspective now, once again, we don't see three of the same spectrum. We do not see Salafiyyah being politicos, quietists, and jihadis, as it were, Yahamakallah, okay? And so if you can remove, I'll leave that for a moment. Hassan, if you can put the other framework, and we're going to see a traverse section of that, yet again, to show that the Salafi community and constituency is one. It isn't three. So you see us in the middle, closer to the middle. Then you move the more insular community. Where that vacuumous pull downwards is where those jihadi or takfiri communities, Khariji communities lurk. And then when you come out, you see the more mainstream Muslim communities, and at the very outer edge, outer circle, the wider society, non-Muslim society, government, agencies, statutory bodies, and the like. So these were frameworks that I used, again, to show a societal context and to counter that narrative that the Ikhwani constituency and ideology, the political one that being that, the Takfiri, violent extremist rhetoric and narrative, and Salafis are all one in the same. These frameworks counter that particular narrative.
No. Yeah, I found those very useful, especially because you were talking in the context a lot of the movement of radicalization, or, you know, and the transference from one group to another, for example. Right. And we've seen this in, we've witnessed this firsthand, how many people who were, for an example, let me give a name, Morten Storm, okay? This is a guy, embraced Islam in Denmark, probably came to the UK after that, I'm not sure. And then he found out about Sheikh Mukbil's camp. He went to Yemen. Even the Sheikh used to, you know, kind of like really know this guy. I mean, I can remember, right, you know, the Sheikh asking for, you know, because his name was Murad at the time. He spent a little bit of time in Damaj, left Damaj, got into with all kind of other characters, especially Ikhwani oriented, then more extreme, so much so to where he was really, you know, knew some big figures in Al-Qaeda in Yemen, and also was trying to go to Somalia. And, you know, he mentions all of this in details, this in his book. And so the point being is, you saw, without that foundation, without, and this is why I always try to emphasize when I'm lecturing to people, learn and establish your foundation. Because once you have a foundation and an understanding of what you believe, of course, this is your aqidah, the creed of Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah, then you're less likely when trials befall you, or, you know, however that reaches you in your life, to just be so fickle where you just run from minhaj to minhaj until your destruction, until you leave Islam. And even there was narrations of the Salaf who regarding this issue of some people, the one who changes from more or less minhaj to minhaj, or, you know, what have you, is understanding that eventually he goes to ilhad, you know, he leaves Islam, or, you know, heresy in totality. And this is what we saw in the case of this particular individual. I knew him personally, and, you know, witnessed it, you know, saw him going. Yeah. Now,
can I ask, I'm really glad you've given that personal insight, and we can give that. And I remember reading Morten Storm's book. I do recall him attending Brixton Mosque on one or two occasions. He mentioned me in his book that my sermons, my khutbahs were not fiery enough, and they didn't appeal to where he was going. And so relief went extreme from even his statement. But where would you place him now? If you remember and I'll ask Hassan to put the first framework up, how would you explain him moving across these? And I want to make it clear, these concentric circles do not mean individuals necessarily move across them and become radicalized, because some may misunderstand that. Again, these are how these particular communities are situated, are located, are structured according to the Combating Terrorism Center. And from my experience and research, this is quite accurate. If we were to look at a Sufi community and Deobandis and other particular elements from a different perspective of Muslim communities, they would have their own constituencies situated in different arrangements to what we're looking at. But looking at Morten Storm, for example, while this is up there, and I'm going to take it down very quickly, I'd ask you, Khalid, to say, based on what you saw, he went to Yemen. So then he went into the Salafi constituency. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, definitely. That's who he.
And then where did he move after from the Salafi community?
Then, if you want to say Islamist, you know, he kind of got with a lot of Kutubists. You know, he was influenced by those guys. Those guys were treating him really nice in Yemen. Maybe they had money and stuff. They were, you know, meeting needs that he felt he wasn't having met with the Salafis. And, you know, because he was not grounded from the get-go. Then from there, he went to the jihadi takfiris, because he has written I even have some quotes in my research where other academics have used him as an example. I forgot what they call it, Abu Osama Denmarki or something, I guess was his kunya. And he, they referred to him, and he had lectures similar to Faisal's lectures, like the conspiracy of the Saudi Salafis. That's a famous one from Faisal, but he had some similar lectures, something of the whatever of the Salafis. So you just saw he was like a ping pong ball. And I know the guy personally. We used to hang out. We used to drink coffee and tea in Sana'a together in the capital of Yemen, and also in Damaj. And so I know this guy personally, and I saw how he was bouncing around, because there just wasn't he wasn't grounded in knowledge.
You speak to something quite important, or about something quite important there on that framework that we've just highlighted. So because it shows that the individuals will gravitate from the Muslim constituency, and then maybe they get more religious, politicized, for example, they move into the so-called Islamist constituency. But you said that he came into the Salafi community first, then he went outwardly to the Islamist politicized community before moving into the jihadi takfiri. And that's quite interesting, because in my PhD, I actually speak about a reconfiguration of those constituencies, saying that Islamist constituency could be moved next to the jihadi constituency, with the Salafi one being further out. They're interchangeable as to where they are because of the way people move. And I want to give a personal experience concerning Zacarias Moussaoui. Today is the 11th of September. It's 19 years to the day when we saw the terrorist attacks in America, and we know that emanating from that, there's been some complicity. We see from evidence that's come that it wasn't all. There was a lot of smoke and screens that whilst the Muslims were blamed, extremist Muslims were blamed, there was complicity from some Western entities, America being. Now, I'm not going to get into conspiracies or otherwise, but beyond conspiracy, there's evidence there. That's not what I want to speak about at the moment. I want to speak about Zacarias Moussaoui, because he was actually arrested prior to the 9/11 attacks, and or I think a visa violation. But then he was drawn to the authorities' attention because the flight lessons he was actually having, he only wanted to learn to take off and fly. He was not interested in landing. So this drew their attention at the time. You can see that that drew the attention at the time. But I knew Zacarias Moussaoui personally as well. Okay, when he was a nominal Muslim. When he came over, what happened is that when he got his cognitive awakening, he was used to live in south of France, and then he went to college. He was a normal Muslim, started practicing after a long period of not practicing at all. Then he joined university in Montpellier, I believe it was, and there he met the Islamist politicized community, various individuals studying there from different parts of the world, and he would get into political discussions and be hearing what they're saying about what's happening in the Muslim world, in Afghanistan, what happened in Algeria, places like that, Palestine. And so he was politicized at that perspective, that particular stage. He then moved to the UK. And I remember him coming to Brixton Mosque and introducing himself. And he was told to come to Brixton because of the cosmopolitan nature of the community. He heard we were on the Sunnah. And so he came into the Salafi community in that particular instance. He moved away from the politicization, like many did, because he felt that there was too much rhetoric, talk about politics and everything, like we saw with Hizb ut-Tahrir and groups like this. And so he then found the purity of ideology with the Salafi community. But I remember having arguments with him pretty early on because he became very frustrated that he didn't see us being active as he saw it regarding jihad, his understanding of jihad. And he was actually one that I ended up, when he started becoming radicalized and violent extreme rhetoric started coming out from him, I actually told him not to come back to the mosque anymore. We studied in the same university, in the same faculty, me doing my MBA in education, him doing a master's in business administration. And I saw him. So I'm bringing this example, like you've brought the example of Morton Storm Y, to show their movement across that framework. And each of their movements at this time, they would not have said they're Salafi purists, Salafi politico, Salafi jihadi. They saw them as distinct movements in themselves. So the proof, again, as we said a few weeks ago, is in the pudding in that particular regard. And before just moving on slightly, what we have to note when we're talking about Salafis, and as termed by Wagemaker as the quietist, he says here, worldwide, the largest group of Salafis most probably consists of those whose manhaj towards politics and society is one of quietism. They do not believe in engaging in parliamentary participation, want to refrain from political debate and activism in society, and do not want to develop policies on either domestic or foreign issues. This does not mean that they have no political views or never comment on political issues.
Right.
Rather, it means that they believe these should be expressed only in religious terms and privately, or in discreet advice to the rulers of their countries, to whom they are sometimes explicitly loyal, and focus on dawah, education, and preaching instead. So this is quite accurate in that particular instance. And as he's highlighting, Salafis, he says the largest group are Salafi quietists. No, in fact, that is Salafiyyah.
Yeah.
And everything else is according to different trends and movements as they themselves espouse. And Khalid, we've spoken about this 3 demarcation typology from a Western academic perspective, and there's a lot to cover here. But I want to bring in one that I don't know if you referred to that or saw that in my PhD studies, but there's another typology that was given for Salafis, and it was part of a 6-point typology from Tariq Ramadan.
Okay.
In which he spoke about the first one being scholastic traditionalism. And he said here, central to distinguishing characteristics of this group is adherence and reference to religious scriptural texts, in particular the Quran and Hadith. Dependency is upon scholastic explanation and interpretation as codified between the 8th and 11th centuries. That's the first categorization, but he doesn't call it Salafi. He says scholastic traditionalism, which I would say is Salafiyyah.
No.
Then he says the second categorization is Salafi traditionalism. And he says here, adherents to this particular traditionalism ascribe themselves to the first 3 generations of the Muslim era, i.e. the Salaf as-Salih. This group can be distinguished from the first group by its literalist understanding of sacred texts. The third one, I'm going to read 2 more. The third one, Salafi reformism. This group is very close to the traditionalists, with the exception of their insistence upon ijtihad. Then the 4th one he gives, political and literalist Salafiyyah. And he says here, this group's orientation is towards a more radical interpretation of Islam and with a strong emphasis towards development of an Islamic state. What distinguishes them from other categories is their unequivocal opposition to any notion of collaboration with European or Western societies, holding such environments to be Dar al-Harb, realms of war. Now, for me, to be frank, that last one is not Salafiyyah. Again, that is the Khariji, Takfiri, violent extremist constituency and ideology. Okay, the Salafi reformism, close to traditionalists, but their insistence is upon ijtihad. What do you say about that particular entity that he's mentioned? Do you mind commenting upon that? What do you think of that?
I think, like all the other typologies, and I hate to just wipe everything out, but in reality, what I found is all these variations, no matter what, we reject from the Salafi perspective. So if you want to talk about external perspectives, and as you mentioned, even Lefebvre, I forgot his name, the French one, that he himself had that he mentioned, about, he was critiquing that those, and he was talking about the secondary sources. In the construct of my literature review, I said, what is going to make my PhD worth researching and what distinguish it, hopefully, from these other pieces of work out there, is I rely extensively on Salafi sources, as well as those Western sources. I'm emphasizing a lot of the first, what do we call them? Secondary sources and the first sources, whatever you call them. Primary sources. So I used a lot of primary sources, you know, and I lineage, and I said I'm going to be looking at this great imam who's you have to really talk about in contemporary Salafism, like Imam al-Albani, Imam bin Baz, bin Uthaymeen, Imam Fawzan, Imam Muqbil bin Hadi al-Wadi'i, and I just listed, you know, especially those who I would really look into their works, right? Because they are known as their great imams in this trend, if you will, of Salafiyyah. So anyway, getting back specifically to your question, that my goal was to kind of like say, hey, these typologies, they just don't fit. Yes. They don't fit in the sense that Salafis themselves do not have these nuances. Salafi or not Salafi. There are those, so we look at those trends, and as Tariq Ramadan mentioned, you know, you might be able, in a general sense, to say, well, that sounds like Salafiyyah, and a bit of that sounds like Salafiyyah. Okay, you know, in that sense. But again, we would not, we don't make those, consider that nuances of Salafiyyah. And we don't deny ijtihad. And that's where you'll find a lot of the certain rulings different. You know, for example, bin Baz, this is controversial. And that bin Baz allowed for the American troops to come into Saudi Arabia to defend the Haramain, okay, from Saddam Hussein, okay? We know the black and white arguments of the Takfiris, but amongst Salafi scholars that were great imams of the religion, as I just mentioned, Imam al-Albani and Imam Muqbil bin Hadi, they didn't agree with that. But they didn't. This is the difference of how Ahl Sunnah is supposed to deal with their differences, which we don't see on the micro level with the students and the du'at, especially in the West, but even in the East, is that we see how these imams, the imams, they did not belittle and attack one another and call it one another heretics, or that they had left the fold, or the fold of Ahl Sunnah or Salafiyyah. But rather they would say, I disagree with the imam in this and this and this, because these were issues of, you know, these were fatawa. So they were ijtihadiyya based on the book, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and the methodology of the Salaf as-Salih. So their fatawa, that their disagreements is, this is that realm of ijtihad, and this is that realm of, so that's also included. And I went, you know, made painstakingly effort, or put that effort in to mention that in chapter 1 and in other subsequent chapters, to talk about those nuances, that these are nuances that do not take you out of the fold of Salafiyyah. The fact that, look at those scholars that said, okay, if there's a greater maslaha, a greater benefit, to vote, okay? Sheikh Wasi Allah Abbas, Imam Abdul al-Abad, I think bin Uthaymeen, or, you know, several great scholars, they don't, and Imam al-Albani, they don't say, yeah, hey, let's vote, let's start a Democratic Party or something like this. No, going with the Kutubis, but they are talking about, hey, they're looking at all the principles of the religion, because that's what Salafi is supposed to do. It's supposed to give us those tools to look at all the aspects of these masail, that these great imams are the ones, the authority to refer to back on this. And they're looking, some scholars say, no, they close that door. No, don't vote no matter what. There's many other scholars say, hey, if there's going to be, you know, this is like eating pork or something. This is looking at the akhaf dararain, the lesser of the two evils. So if there's a greater harm, for example, by voting for Trump or letting Trump into office, and there's a lesser evil by actually going out to the polls and voting for Joe Biden, for example, it's going to be less harmful for Muslims and minorities in general, then that would be a greater maslaha. That's an example. I'm not encouraging anybody to rush to the polls, but I'm just giving you an example that I've been thinking about a lot recently with what I'm hearing on the ground in America, and realize the implications of what's kind of going on. So I hope that kind of.
No, it does, absolutely. And this moves on to the next one, because Again, sticking with Wajmaker's work, so, and when I was looking and researching this last week, he says something that, and again, coming back to the homogeneity of Salafis, moving away from the typology that we have now, I think, shown, I hope, in this short time, that it doesn't stand up. Neither do the other typologies. Salafiyyah is Salafiyyah, and these other entities are divorced from Salafiyyah for the ideological and methodological reasons that we've been speaking of in the past few sessions and this one today. But he goes and says here, it is clear that Quietist Salafis are not a homogeneous group, but can be divided into 3 different categories. Now, this is the Quietist Salafis. We're not talking about anything politicized or Khariji or in that sense there. And he says here, the first of these may be termed the aloofists. In other words, those who prefer to remain aloof from politics altogether and therefore do not believe in reflexively supporting any policies by the ruler either. They simply want to stay away from politics. The most prominent example of this trend was Syrian Jordanian scholar Muhammad Nasruddin al-Albani. He's actually Albanian Asli, but this is how he refers to him. Then the second trend he refers to is the Quietist Salafi, within the Quietist Salafi manhaj of dealing with politics and society, is that of the loyalists. So we've got the aloofists, the loyalists. He describes these as follows. These Salafis want to refrain from active involvement in politics too, but believe they can or should be called upon to support their rulers' policies whenever they are asked to. Such ideas of loyalty to and support for rulers may emanate from either a genuine belief that this is the correct way or simply from fear of the regime. Important Salafi scholars such as the Saudis Abdulaziz bin Baz and Muhammad ibn Salih al-Uthaymeen rahimahullah belong to this category, although loyalist scholars exist in other countries of the Muslim world as well. Then he says the third group, and we're talking about these shortly. The third group within Quietist Salafism takes this position a step further by preferring the active propagation of loyalty to a certain regime, particularly the Saudi one. To these propagandists, as he calls them, they support their support for the rulers almost becomes an article of faith. And examples of this trend, such as the Saudi Rabi bin Hadi al-Madkhali, are therefore vehement in their criticism of those Salafis who dare question their rulers' wisdom. And then he says here in conclusion of these 3 categories under Quietist Salafiyyah, the differences between the 3 groups labeled aloofists, loyalists, and propagandists are not so great. However, that they are hostile to each other. Generally speaking, they still see each other as allies. They still see each other as allies. So that's interesting that he's moved the other 2 categorizations away. He's not conflating Salafis with the politicos, the Ikhwani Muslimin, and the so-called jihadis, Kharijis, but he's saying there's aloofists, loyalists, propagandists. In my opinion, that's further hair splitting among the Salafis. Okay. Remember the first podcast that we spoke about, I asked you about this and we said, okay, there may be stronger allegiances to particular regional scholars, be it Yemen, be it Jordan, be it Saudi, be it India, in that particular instance. But we don't now divide Salafis because of that in the way that he's divided them here. Would you agree with me on that?
I definitely would agree with you on that. And again, as you said, the hair splitting is rejected. I don't see that. And just to further on what you said, or is that, for example, Dr. Qadi, Yasser Qadi, he what kind of amazed me with him having been Salafi at one point, propagating the Salafi dawah and methodology, if you will. And that was his core training in Saudi Arabia. But you see now, for example, in his paper, I think it's called Salafi Matters and some other works, he also goes back to then support some of those, going back to those Western academics for his criterion of Salaf. He was supporting, if I recall, he was mentioning like 8 categories. And he called the Salafi Jordanians and this and this and this trend and this Egyptian, this and that. He was really drawing all sorts of new lines of trying to distinguish what he felt were different trends within Salafiyyah. And again, that's completely rejected. Of course, the fact that a Salafi in America is going to have different issues and different realities to deal with compared to a Salafi in Saudi Arabia. There's no doubt about that there's going to be different realities, but their principles and their foundation and their methodology is the same. It's one and the same. The ijtihadat of the scholars in those places about particular issues will be different because Saudi Arabia is a very different country than the United States of America. It's a Muslim government. It has a Muslim authority. There's the hearing and the obeying, which is according to the principles of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah. And, there's all kind of different nuances there. So anyhow, and to make it short, definitely we reject that, as well as, all these categories that we see. It's really problematic. And again, it has to be, these nuances, they have to be looked at in an academic way and looking back. And that's why I spent that effort in my chapter 1 saying, hey, listen, first we need to define what Salafiyyah is. We need to look at those, so that way we have the tools to build off of, so that when we hear the scholarship, which it's shameful that somebody like Dr. Qadi, and I'm not using this to necessarily bash him, so to speak, but it's shameful because he is an authority that was within Salafiyyah at one time, who has chose to transition, has illustrated his transitioning from the fold of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah with all of these new ideologies which violate all the, so many principles of the foundation principles of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah, like as far as, working with every group in the world, and I would rather sit with an extreme Sufi than a Salafi, all kind of strange concepts, which he has no problem. I mean, he's, if you go to a Salafi matters thing, it shouldn't be a thing of your what's the scholars mentioned, atifa, that your desires and your affection for somebody, but you have to look at what somebody says, and then you put it on the scale of what is Salafiyyah and what is the right way. What does Allah say? What does the messenger say? Then what does your individual that you attach yourself to, what does he say? How does that fit within that scale?
No, and I think, alhamdulillah, and I think that we've dealt with this issue of the typologies quite emphatically, and I want to refer to those who would support what we've been elucidating upon today from an academic perspective. And I'm going to refer to the work of Annabelle Inge from her book and her PhD studies, The Making of a Salafi Woman. And she says here, typologies certainly have their uses. They can help us to understand the similarities and differences between groups and interpretations and their relationships with one another. But using the term Salafi inclusively to refer to such a wide range of interpretations and groups can have the opposite effect. Especially if we are not meticulous in our qualification of the term. This is for 3 reasons. First, doing so may perpetuate widespread confusion regarding the term Salafi, which nowadays seems to appear in the media whenever there is an attempted or successful terrorist attack, often without qualification. This blanket use of the term puts non-violent conservative Muslims at risk of further marginalization and maybe even criminalization. It is particularly problematic in the Western context, where most Salafis are non-violent and often quietists. Second, the 3 Salafi types share the same creed is not strictly true. Quietists condemn as bid'ah the more political group's invocation of an additional category of Tawheed called Tawheed al-Hakamiyyah, unity of sovereignty, to justify more organized or violent activities. They also disagree on other essential aspects of creed, such as the conditions for belief and disbelief and how to understand some of Allah's attributes. This weakens the basis for classifying the 3 strands as all part of the same movement. And thirdly, she says here, by locating the only points of difference squarely in the political domain, The three-part typology encourages the mistaken belief that purists are completely apolitical and lack a concrete program of Islamic reform. So this is Dr. Annabel Inge's research, and she highlights this in her book, which I was really appreciative of. But then I want to draw to a conclusion by looking at a Master's of Arts thesis from an individual called Ahmed Javad Isa, University of Kingston, and this came from the Political and International Relations Department. He completed his MA 2016-2017, and the title was "Is Daesh a Salafi Group? A Study of the Development and Conception of the Ideology of ISIS." And what he says here, and Khalid, I'll bring it back to you to conclude. I hope you don't mind. I'm rounding up what we've been looking at, and I think this is a nice way to round it off, to confirm what we've been speaking to and about, to debunk the typologies that have proliferated over the past two decades, regarding Salafiyyah now. And again, the Doctor's Lab, as Salafi academics, Salafi practitioners, those who are on the ground, who've got skin in the game, so to speak, are speaking and I think redressing the imbalance and the incorrect academic perspectives that have affected Salafiyyah due to these conflations. So he mentions here, quote, the religious fundamentalism of one has become the associated norm of the other. A confusion arises when the two groups are labeled as one, and he's talking about Daesh and Salafiyyah. And a greater dilemma is faced when the media presents the enemy, quote unquote, to the people. Daesh is essentially an extremist group that subverts the core tenets of the Islamic faith and causes mayhem and mass destruction, to say the least. Their brand of takfirism has led to the assumption that they are in lieu with the Salafis due to their few shared doctrinal tenets. I think he means tenets. However, to say they are Salafi is the same as labeling them standard bearers for the Islamic faith. The differences between the two come in many forms, from the ideological to the political. They are not the same, and it can be said with some certainty that Daesh are not Salafis. Rather, they are a cultish brand of apocalyptic ideologues who have no say in the affairs of Muslims, nor are they representatives of anyone save themselves. Then he goes on. He refers to a particular text, and he said that those texts have become fundamental in establishing the argument that Salafiyyah is something quite distinct from extremism. Though the thesis can find cases of hardline Salafi ideology, these do not become reasons of affiliation with Daesh. Rather, many of these points have helped to prove that the two are incompatible. Some of the texts include the approach that Salafi jihadism is the root of radicalism. However, these texts really expand clearly on these theories, basing their arguments on the similarities in theology that Salafis share with extremists, but failing to mention the numerous differences that are between them. Even in terms of theology, the differences far outweigh the similarities once properly studied. It seems quite irresponsible of some authors to claim that there are two somehow inked without giving a balanced argument. And concluding here, Khalid, before I hand back to you, the findings of most Western-based academia are that the two are conclusively linked, as one proclaims to be the other, though this is fallacious on the part of the academics, as they have been goaded into accepting this extraordinary proclamation. This has led to the same demonization of Salafis in the academic world that the wider Muslim population finds in the media and everyday life. Very emphatic from this particular academic, Ahmed Javad Isa. And I think that those two conclusive academic papers that I've referred to from Dr. Annabel Inge and this particular master's graduate confirm and endorse our conversation and discussion today about the precariousness of conflating these three distinct movements under the umbrella of Salafiyyah.
Yeah. A lot of his conclusions there, I basically concur with. That's what I found in my research. Obviously, I approached it with detailing some of those things in different ways, especially getting into like chapter 2 is when I actually start to talk what is Salafi's view on extremism, and then a comparison between Daesh or ISIS's methodology versus Salafi methodology, and so on and so forth, and what they say about Salafi scholars and who they hold to be scholars and what is their criterion and what is the criterion of Salafis. So I just want to end. This is, I don't know if it's going to be clear, but this is a little bit of my own, this is a diagram that I did, which I think is a more accurate way of looking at that, talking about the political aims that distinguishes between Salafis, not these are trends of Salafiyyah, but Salafis, the politicals, and the jihadis. So Salafis, I'll read it just for clarity really quickly. Salafis, their main focus is individual reform and societal reform, but they believe from the bottom up. Really, we can honestly say that Salafis in general are scholars, and what has been the methodology in general has been the focus of knowledge and and reforming the self. We can go to countless narrations of the Salaf and Ahl Hadith and the later day generations up until now to see that is their methodology for reforming the individual, or their primary aim, and that the society and the world will change from that. Whereas the politicals, they see that leadership and authority are the primary focus, so they will use, it could be democratic means, it could be whatever means, to get that to really kind of attain leadership in a Muslim or a non-Muslim society. And their focus is on authority and, that representation. The jihadi takfiri groups in general, their focus, which is very fascinating when you think about another point I'm going to make, is the fall of secular regimes and the fall or terrorize to fall or to terrorize the far enemy. The far enemy meaning the non-Muslim societies. So this is where you have Al-Qaeda and stuff. You don't see that Al-Qaeda and Daesh and Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, that they have any real platform or program. Their program is instability. And then they always say Sharia, Sharia, Sharia. But you see, they were willing to do anything to violate the Sharia in order to propagate the Sharia. So we say that's complete falsehood and not representative of Islam. You can't, for example, in Saudi Arabia, when I was living there, this was in the mid 2000s, that some of the Al-Qaeda guys were really active in doing attacks in Saudi Arabia, and they dressed in niqabs. They wore niqabs and hijabs. Even the original Khawarij would have never done that. But these contemporary extremists, in order just to cause instability, because they sure weren't going to establish a state, they sure weren't going to, there was no program. You weren't going to better your iman or anybody else's iman, but your whole goal is just to dismantle. Look at Shabab now. All they do is make Somalia unstable and ungovernable. They never want Somalia to thrive as a state and grow, but instead it's about instability and imposing their deviant ideology. Boko Haram, blowing up women in the fish market and things like this. It's crazy. And again, their focal point is what? It's instability. Instability in these West African nations, Nigeria and Mali and other places. And it's about terrorizing the regime and then, of course, the far enemy. And so that was some of those other groups. So you see that there are different, that right there, those are, I would say even methodological. Those are minhaji issues, in that the goal, we're focusing on the individual, and by the individuals being reformed, your family and yourselves, the greater society is going to be reformed. The politicals are saying, no, we need to vote. We need to look at in the West, we have all these groups that are, pushing politics and rushing into politics, marching with completely anti-Islamic group, as far as the morality of Islam and other things, marching hand in hand, dancing with them, all kind of strange things in order to gain political position, thinking that they can assimilate in the society, which, and again, they're going to slap you, because as African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans and others we found in those societies that were built on white supremacy, we found that assimilation still did not benefit the people. And the same thing with the Muslims. The Muslims don't know that, because a lot of them are immigrant communities and they don't know. They don't have that same experience. But they will find that they will have to sell their religion completely, and they still may not be accepted until they just keep their name. Okay. And so, and then the last category, as I said, the jihadis, they really have no vision. Their vision is instability and chaos and mayhem and bloodshed. And subhanAllah, when I make these claims, I go into depth in chapter 2 and 3 and just give you the things that ISIS were saying. They were praising there was a Tunisian guy who went on the beach and went on a massacre, shooting up sunbathers, and they were praising the great Mujahid, so-and-so, who never prayed prior to that, was probably in the club prior to that. And I think if we look to see what his background was, it was like that. But he got inspired and he did something stupid. And then you have other extremists. They say something, they quote, these are their quotes. I'm going to bring some of their quotes when we get to there. It's very good. If you can't make hijrah to us, because they feel they're the only legitimate entity, the only Islamic state, which wasn't really a state, and that's a whole another issue. But they believe they were the only legitimate Islamic entity. You either make hijrah to us, like the original Khawarij said, or you can do your part, but the original Khawarij didn't believe in this necessarily. You can do your part by just getting a knife and stabbing the people in the park, and they even mentioned the ice cream vendor, the hot dog seller, the little kid with the ice cream cone in his mouth, just anything to propagate evil and this chaotic methodology.
And this, Jazakallah khair, Khalid. And as we conclude, this speaks to the theory that was first I expounded upon from Al-Mutayri. He his master's degree was then translated into contemporary extremism, 21st century or 20th. And he spoke about belief-related extremism and deed-related extremism, ideological extremism, behaviorally. And I took that further. And he went back to the Khuwaisara, but he only spoke and limited him to deed-related or behavioral extremism. I said, no, he made that statement based on an ideological premise, and the Sahaba, Umar radiallahu an at the time, understood that ideological deviation, hence him asking, shall I kill him, O Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? So I took that further forward in a Western construct, talking about behavioral extremism, ideological extremism, and that behavioral extremism is subjective, depending on societal context in some instances. But when it's informed by ideological extremism, of which you've spoken, these things kill this one, destruction, everything. There's an ideological deviation upon which those actions are premised. And I think we can conclude on that perspective, because we don't want to go down that road now. We've gone to an hour and nearly 15 minutes. But as our host in the background is highlighting, and I alluded to it, we are 19 years on to the day from 9/11. Yeah. And we see that as well. Today, we still see today, subsequent to those events, that those at the forefront and most effective in dealing with and countering the narrative of extremism are the Salafis. That was the same preceding 9/11 in the 90s. And there is no one, I'll make this statement, it's a bold statement and claim, which I'm sure you and Salafis will agree with. There is no one on the face of the earth today, tomorrow and yesterday, and about tomorrow Allah knows best, who continue to be the most effective, best suited with the firmest creed and methodology to counter and combat extremism, except the Salafis. And that's not because we are part of the same mosaic as these extremists and these politicized entities. It's because we stand separate to them with an aqidah and manhaj that is attached to the first three generations, that we know how to contextualize within each era, 21st century as we speak at the moment now. and it is not predicated upon the politicized understandings you've just so articulately highlighted, or the violent, destructive methodologies that you've also highlighted and expounded upon. So the conflation of the typology is a false premise. And I think we have illustrated that today. And I hope this has been definitive enough for non-Muslims and Muslims, those who are non-Salafi and Salafi, to hear it from insider perspectives, Salafi academics who not only have experienced and know this reality, but have studied it, examined, and challenged those narratives.
No. Jazakallah khair. I have nothing else to add, because I don't want to open any other doors, because some of the things that you're saying were detailed in there, and that'll be for our further discussions, bi-idhnillah.
Jazakallah khair, Khalid. And I want to thank the audience for spending time with us. And sometimes I know we've gone into a bit of detail, but that was the purpose of, and is the purpose of, the Doctor's Lab. And we look forward to speaking and engaging in the 2 weeks' time. Some may be thinking, why were some particular questions not fielded today by our invigilator and host? We are speaking about context and constructs and issues and things. And one of the things we do not want to be diverted away from is looking at some of the entities within Salafiyyah who are now no longer in Salafiyyah, and critiquing them. This was not the purpose of these shows, hence us focusing on the task at hand. So please don't feel disheartened if your questions and specific questions haven't come up. We're not ignoring them because we can't deal with the questions, but we have got a specific focus that we really want to get out there for the Muslims and the non-Muslims who have got misunderstandings about this very pure, noble ideology and methodology. Yes, Salafiyyah is the Haqq. It is Islam. Salafis sometimes, often, we do not live up to those standards, but do not judge Salafiyyah by the practice or malpractice of some of us adherents, inshallah. And I will conclude on that basis, and again say Jazakumullah khair to all of you. Jazakallah khair for a very engaging show. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allah yubarak fikum. Jami'an, everyone.